Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this episode of the Rose and Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chavla, and I'm pleased to be joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunella Rosa. And this week, we're talking about Brazilian President Lula's recent visit to China and what that sort of spells for China's future as a broker of international affairs. Brunella, could you just start off by kind of painting the bird's eye view? I mean, him and Chinese President Xi Jinping discussed the war in Ukraine. What came out of this discussion?
Yeah, so Lula flew to Beijing and had a series of meetings, of course, with Chinese policymakers and, of course, including the President Xi. And among the various things that they discussed, and we have seen a series of these travels from presidents to prime ministers in the last few weeks. We discussed about Macron, for example. So there's always a commercial content, but it's not just, of course, bilateral commercial relationships. It's also about the world and, of course, not least the war in Ukraine. So the position of Brazil, which used to be a non-aligned country during Cold War I, more or less like India, was that there should be a sort of group of countries that should offer to become kind of mediators between Russia and Ukraine. So far, nothing particularly new. But then, on his way back from China to Brazil, in Abu Dhabi in particular, the Brazilian president made some important remarks. In particular, he said that Western countries, particularly European countries and the US, should stop sending weapons to Ukraine because this is prolonging the conflict. Now, of course, this was welcomed very much by Russia, as you can imagine, but not so much in Western capitals. So to some extent, in following days, Lula had to backtrack a bit and said, of course, it announced the violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity by Russia, and that to some extent condemned the invasion. He repeated that a group of countries needed to kind of be selected in order to mediate the process. But you know, as often happens, is the things that are out of line, so to speak, that stick. And in this case, of course, there was this idea that is the West that is prolonging the war because is providing the weapons to Ukraine. To some extent, is like it seemed like, oh, you should just allow Russia to do its job and Ukraine to surrender, and the war will be over soon, without much more kind of victims and so on. Well, clearly this position is not acceptable, and that's why I had to backtrack. But it's, I would say, a signal of, of a much more general attitude among policy leaders around the world.
Sure. And what do you think sort of reflects about Lula's own kind of political views and why he came up with such comments, specifically on sort of, how does he place within the political spectrum inside Brazil?
Well, I would say there are three reasons because Lula said those things. First of all, domestically, he was elected on a totally anti-Bolsonaro platform, of course, and Bolsonaro was close to the US, at least the Trump's US, clearly much less so to the Biden's administration. And so Lula, perhaps bringing back to the fore some anti-American sentiment in Latin America and so on, play the usual card that, Latin America cannot be simply the backyard of US positions and so on and so forth. So that, I would say, is the domestic political reason. From a more international perspective, Brazil already belongs to BRICS. Let's not forget that. So to some extent, Brazil is is already discussing on a, I would say, continuous basis with Russia and China, which of course are constituents of BRICS, and India, of course, which is also a non-aligned country. To some extent, we have discussed about the position of India many times. And therefore is already open to listening to their positions. Furthermore, we know that China has made huge strides in signing up people with MOUs for the BRI in Latin America. We discussed in the past about Argentina, but it's not the only one. It's Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Uruguay, and so on. So there's an entire context of countries in Latin America that is very much open to hearing what China and Russia have to say. And then third, and I guess that's really the focus of this week newsletter, is that China is becoming a much more prominent broker of international affairs.
Right. Let's dig a bit more to that sort of last point you mentioned of China becoming a more kind of important broker in world affairs. Because, you know, increasingly it's not only in Russia, Ukraine that it's trying to take this sort of mediating position. They also did something important in the Middle East between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Could you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, so China has been able to position itself in situation where other countries couldn't do the same. For example, in the Middle East, they became the broker of the sort of treaty agreement, call it as you want, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, who's been, of course, fighting for decades, if not centuries, if you really want to go back in history. In the same region, clearly, they are able to speak with, at the same time, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and these are all historical enemies. And somehow, when they speak with China, they're all open to hear what they have to say. In Asia, they speak with India and Pakistan, and somehow also they keep them on the same table. So clearly, China has this ability of speaking to long-term enemies at the same time, with the position that the US has not managed to do. And, you know, these I would say, peace treaty agreement, call it as you want, between Saudi Arabia and Iran is particularly relevant because every US president, if they have achieved a similar result, of course, would have publicized that with a great fanfare and say, you know, it's the US that has managed to put these two contenders around the table, sign it, you know, the same way they did for the various agreements between the Palestinians and the Israelis, you know, Camp David, Washington, whatever. There's always a US president that is very keen in showing that these things are signed in the US, and thanks to the US mediation. So China is now taking part of this job, if you want, the world stage, and has shown that the US is not anymore the monopolist of that kind of position.
Right, and I mean, it's also worth remembering when the US was, you know, the world sort of mediator and broker, no power is ever entirely neutral in that stance. And so in those sort of negotiations and brokering process, it sort of embeds within its own worldview. It's going to be a very interesting sort of, you know, few years in the global order when instead of the United States, it's China embedding that sort of worldview with its own values. So certainly we'll continue to watch. But as always, Brunello, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you very much.